We have all witnessed it. Someone goes and sees a movie and immediately says, this is one of the best movies of all time. This is their favorite movie of all time. And they're declaring it one of the greatest films ever made about 10 seconds after watching it. And then about 6 months later, nobody is talking about that movie anymore. That's why I usually try to pump the brakes on these kinds of statements. I like to let a movie settle before I decide where it belongs on my all-time favorite rankings. Obsession has made that incredibly difficult. I walked out of my first viewing completely blown away, and instead of cooling off, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I went back and I watched it again. So I saw it twice in theaters. Somehow it was even better the second time around. And that's when I realized that this wasn't just another horror movie that I enjoyed. This was something special. So if you have been living underneath a rock for the last couple of months, Obsession tells the story of Bear, this young guy who's desperate to win over the girl of his dreams, and that leads him to make a wish with horrifying consequences. What begins as like an awkward romance slowly transforms into this unsettling psychological horror story about love, control, and what happens when someone gets exactly what they think they want. Now, no spoilers. This movie is fucking incredible. You should pause this review, go watch it immediately. It just came out on streaming services, so you can go rent it or buy it, or you can go see it in theaters. I would recommend going and see it in theaters, but see it nonetheless. Just take my advice and go spend the money and go watch it. This is one of the best horror movies in recent memory. But I want to dive into some very specific things going forward. So I will be talking spoilers past this point. So if you have not seen Obsession and you plan on seeing it, this is your moment to push pause and then come back once you have seen it. Or if for whatever reason you don't give a shit about spoilers, then by all means continue on with this review. But I would highly recommend going and see that movie with little to no knowledge of what it actually is. So what impressed me the most about this movie is that it starts off with an idea that almost everyone can understand. Most of us have had someone that we couldn't stop thinking about. Maybe you rehearsed conversations in your head. Maybe you wondered what it would be like if they actually felt the same way that you feel about them. Those emotions are incredibly normal, which is exactly why the beginning of this movie feels so grounded. It brings in some emotions, some things in life that everybody experiences and makes that super relatable. The opening scene does an excellent job of putting you in Bear's shoes. You immediately understand how isolated he feels and how badly he wants someone to love him, specifically Nikki. And even if you've never been in this exact situation, you would recognize those feelings. The movie earns your sympathy almost instantly in the first few minutes of the movie. And that's important because it makes the rest of the story hit so much harder. As Bear's wish starts changing reality, the movie slowly shifts your perspective. The guy you were rooting for at the very beginning of the movie becomes someone you're increasingly uncomfortable with watching. And that's not because the writing suddenly changes directions. It's because the movie starts peeling back the layers of what his wish actually means. And as that story unfolds, he becomes an abuser of sorts. At first, it sounds harmless. He just wants Nikki to love him. But that's not really what he truly wants. He wants certainty. He wants ownership. He wants someone who could never leave. And those are two completely different things in the grand scheme of things. One of my favorite concepts that gets explored in this movie is the distinction between love and romance, or love and possession. There's a line earlier in the film where Nikki talks about the difference between romance and a love story. And I think that the conversation quietly becomes the foundation for everything that follows after that moment. Bear mistakes obsession for love. Real love requires another person to make a choice. Obsession removes that choice entirely. Once Nikki loses the ability to decide for herself, every interaction between them becomes unsettling. It doesn't matter how affectionate she appears on the surface because the audience knows that something underneath just isn't right. And that's what makes the horror work so well within this movie. This isn't simply a monster movie or a slasher film or some supernatural thriller. It's watching someone lose their identity while another person mistakes that loss for happiness. And what adds to that unsettling feeling throughout the entire movie, what adds to the terrifying aspects of this one wish, there are several moments where the real Nikki briefly breaks through. And I thought those scenes were absolutely heartbreaking. Sometimes it's just this blood curdling scream. Sometimes it's a look on her face. Sometimes it's only a few seconds where you realize the real Nikki is still trapped somewhere inside her. Those moments completely changed how I viewed the movie. And from that point forward, I stopped seeing Bear as someone chasing love and started seeing him as someone refusing to let go, just taking ownership over Nikki. Even scenes that could have been played as romantic become deeply disturbing because you understand what's actually happening beneath the surface. There's a sex scene in the middle portion of the movie, and it's after a fight, and you're looking at the scene, and I didn't really notice it the first time that I watched the movie. It was on my second viewing. They were having sex after a fight, and it was just the most emotionless sex scene that I've ever seen in my life. And the second viewing really brought everything into focus for me, where yeah, he is doing it. He's taking advantage of her. And if you look at her performance, Indy Navarrette's performance, she is just catatonic, just lifeless there. And it's because she is not wanting that to happen. So it is essentially a rape scene from the very get go. And it's things like that throughout the entire movie that just adds to the horror. It makes everything more terrifying. And one of the great things about the movie is that it doesn't spell things out for you. It trusts the audience to understand that, in this case specifically, that Nikki's body may be present here, but the person Bear actually loved isn't there. And that just, again, adds to the horror elements of the movie and just makes it all the more terrifying. The performances elevate all of this to another level. Everyone on the cast is strong, but let's be honest here, this is Indy Navarrette's movie, and I'm not going to say anything that hasn't already been said about her performance. It's all over social media, TikTok. Every review mentions her performance, and I'm not going to say anything different. I think this is one of my favorite performances in recent memory, and definitely my favorite performance of the year so far. And again, not saying anything that hasn't already been said. I'm just here to confirm what y'all already know. The amount of emotional range that she has to cover is just truly astonishing. She isn't just playing one version of Nikki. She's constantly shifting back and forth between vulnerability, affection, fear, desperation. And sometimes those changes happen over the course of a scene, and it's multiple times. Sometimes they happen over the course of a single sentence where she's just flipping back and forth between multiple emotions. There were several moments where a single change in her facial expression completely transformed the mood of not only the character, but the scene itself. And watching it for a second time, I was able to zone in on some of those moments and really appreciate what she was doing with her performance. It's the kind of performance that just sticks with you way longer after the movie than most others. The makeup effects and visual tricks certainly help, but they only work because the acting underneath them is so convincing. And I want to give Curry Barker a ton of credit for the way that he directed this movie. He's clearly not interested in throwing in a jump scare at you every 5 minutes. Instead, he builds tension, understands the anticipation is often scarier than the payoff. There are multiple scenes where the camera lingers just a little longer than you expect. And those are some of my favorite moments in a horror movie. I always go back to James Wan and The Conjuring, where he plays with your emotion. He just draws the scene out a little longer than it should, and it puts you closer and closer to the edge of your seat. And then you find yourself scanning every corner of the frame because you're convinced something is about to happen. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And that uncertainty keeps you completely locked in for the duration of a movie. The sound design deserves just as much praise Barker knows exactly when to let a room become completely silent and then exactly when to break that silence. The scares feel earned because they're built on tension rather than those cheap editing tricks. And that is something that I will always appreciate about his direction here and how he edited the movie and whatnot. I also wouldn't describe this as a traditional horror movie. I went into it, and for the first several minutes of the movie, I'm like, this is not really the vibe that I thought it was going to be. I also wouldn't describe this as a traditional horror movie. It's much quieter than that. It reminds me a lot of It Follows in the sense that it's constantly creating this uncomfortable atmosphere. The horror just isn't coming from what's on screen. It's coming from the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong. Even during the calm moments, the movie never lets you relax. That lingering sense of dread stays with you from the beginning to the end. And guys, It Follows is in my top 10 favorite horror movies of all time. So the fact that I am comparing this movie to It Follows shows you just how serious I am about how much I love this movie obsession. When I finished my second viewing, I actually went back through my movie rankings from the last several years because I wanted to see where this landed. And the more I thought about it, the higher it climbed. Right now, I genuinely think this is one of my 2 or 3 favorite movies released in the last 5 or 6 years. For horror specifically, it's already sitting comfortably in my personal top 20 of all time. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if another viewing pushes it closer to my top 10, maybe even in my top 10. And that's not something I say very often. My top 10 favorite horror movies of all time is a list that doesn't really change. It's ingrained in me. That list doesn't move one way or the other. This is the kind of movie that reminds me of why I love those independent horror movies so much. The mainstream horror movies are great, don't get me wrong, but independent horror is just the way to go. I absolutely fucking love indie horror. It doesn't rely on massive budgets or nonstop spectacles. Instead, it trusts its performances and its atmosphere and its central idea. When those things come together this well, you end up with something that stays with you long after the credits roll. And for me, Obsession is just one of the best horror movies of not only this year, but in the last decade for sure. It's one of the best films that I've seen in years, and I highly recommend you go check it out. If you've already seen it, I'd love to hear your interpretation of it down below in the comment section. So drop me a comment down there because I think this is one of the movies that gets more interesting the more people talk about it. I have legitimately not stopped thinking about this movie since I saw it 3 days ago. So to me, I'm always trying to figure out little things, little hidden details that I might have missed. I've been watching a ton of TikToks. So consider me obsessed. But guys, I appreciate y'all joining me for this review. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That's really going to help us grow the channel. And with that being said, I will catch y'all next time on another episode. Later.